This is the CBS Evening News with Roger Mudd, substituting for Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. 270 persons were killed this afternoon when an American Airlines jumbo jet crashed just minutes after takeoff from Chicago's O'Hare Airport. It was the worst U.S. air disaster, almost doubling the toll from a Pacific Southwest Airlines crash in San Diego exactly 8 months ago. The DC-10, Flight 191, was bound nonstop to Los Angeles. According to witnesses, the plane lost an engine just moments after takeoff. An American Airlines spokesman said preliminary investigation indicated the left engine malfunctioned. Witnesses said the engine dropped to the ground and exploded into flames as the plane began to roll over in the air. It crashed belly up. Much of the debris fell on some trailer parks near the runway's edge at Elk Grove Township. Some injuries were reported there. Area hospitals had been alerted to receive casualties, but later were told to cancel the alert. There were no survivors. All 270 persons aboard were killed. O'Hare, the nation's busiest airport, was shut down briefly, but some runways later reopened. Departing flights were delayed up to an hour. An eyewitness described the crash.
I talked to the FAA, and they said that the one engine was laying back on the runway. He evidently lost it right on takeoff, and he was trying to correct the problem as he came over Touhy Avenue here. But then when the hydraulic system went out and the other engine died, he just lost it completely and crashed over here.
So the plane actually came down perpendicular to the ground?
Right. The left wing dug a path, and as soon as it collapsed and it hit the ground, the spark set off the jet fuel, and this whole place was nothing but a sheet of flame.
Thank you.
CBS News will present a special broadcast on the air crash tonight at 11:30, 10:30 Central Time.
Ford, drive Subaru. This car fills my energy bill.
That's why Ford drive Subaru.
Mercury drive Subaru. Takes more punishment than I ever had to.
Pinto drive Subaru. Man alive with a four-wheel drive.
Take it from a Dodge. Drive Subaru.
Cadillacs drive Subaru.
Four-wheel drive, ain't no jive.
That's why Cadillacs drive Subaru.
This is the famous Académie du Vin, the only school of wine tasting in all of Paris. Its founder, Stephen Spurrier, recently tasted Taylor California Cellars Rosé wine.
I think what's remarkable about California Cellars Rosé is that it's so well made. So fresh, so fruity, so well balanced, and so easy and pleasant to drink. I think for table wine rosé, this is probably the best bet there is.
Taylor California Cellars, a better rosé. Judge for yourself.
The first American to be executed against his will since 1967 died in the Florida electric chair this morning. A last-minute appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court today failed to save 30-year-old John Spenkelink. Just before the execution, Florida Governor Bob Graham was quoted as telling the prison superintendent, "There are no stays at this time. May God be with us." Bruce Hall reports from the Florida State Prison in Stark.
Somebody's dying, Lord, somebody. Somebody's dying, Lord, somebody. Somebody's dying, Lord, somebody. Oh, Lord, somebody.
Anti-capital punishment protesters gathered across the road from the prison, singing and chanting, as they had done 3 days earlier when John Spenkelink's execution had been stayed. However, the demonstrators seemed to know there would be no stay this time. And when the hearse arrived, many in the crowd wept. As the time for the execution approached, a contingent of state troopers took up positions in front of the huge prison. Inmates began yelling and banging on their cell bars. Only 5 minutes before John Spenkelink was brought to the death chamber, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final plea. At 10 o'clock, his 5.5-year battle to avoid the death penalty for the murder of a traveling companion was coming to an end. At 11 minutes past 10, everyone was in place. 2 hooded executioners stood by. A minute later, they were ordered to pull the switch. Reporters and a CBS News artist witnessed the scene.
He had no opportunity to make a final statement. He simply looked at us, and he looked terrified. There was nothing said. They flipped the rubber hood down over his face, and immediately afterwards, there was a surge of electricity. He only really moved once. You could see his hands clench, and his leg move. After that, there was really no perceptible movement from him. It was quieter than I expected. It was less gruesome than I expected. What sticks with me is his eyes. He just looked at us, and his eyes were wide, and he was terrified.
At 10:18, John Spinkelink was pronounced dead. For his sister, who stood across the way with the protesters, and for his attorneys, and for his supporters, it was the end of a lengthy fight. When the hearse bearing Spinkelink's body pulled away, the noisy demonstrators fell silent. And some of the policemen, called murderers by the protesters, were seen holding their hats in their hands as the hearse passed by. Bruce Hall, CBS News, at the Florida State Prison.
2 Mississippi men scheduled to die Monday were the next prisoners facing execution, but one of them was granted a stay today, and state's attorneys say they believe the second execution also will be put off. Fred Graham looks at the nation's death rows in the aftermath of the Spinkelink case.
Most legal experts believe that the death of John Spinkelink will touch off a chain of executions, but that it will not get underway until sometime next year because of legal delays, and that it will not involve nearly as many deaths as is generally believed. There are 489 men and 5 women on death rows in 24 states, but many of these prisoners will be given commuted sentences by state governors after all legal appeals are over. Most of the upcoming executions are from 4 southern states: Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and Texas. These states are out front because their death penalty laws were upheld in 1976 when the Supreme Court struck down about half of the other states' capital punishment statutes, thus forcing them to pass new laws and start all over. Public opinion polls show a steady rise in the percentage of people who favor capital punishment. According to the latest CBS New York Times poll, 69% of the voters now favor the death penalty. But that rise came during a period when no people were actually being put to death. And opponents of capital punishment say that now that human beings are actually being killed, many people will have second thoughts about the desirability of executions. Fred Graham, CBS News, at the Supreme Court.
A Utah Deputy Attorney General said today he hoped the electrocution of John Spinkelink would open a floodgate of executions on death row. Michael Deemer, one of the state prosecutors who pushed for Gary Gilmore's execution 2 years ago, said today, "I'm very pleased the Spinkelink sentence was carried out. It demonstrates a great deal of value we place on human life," he said, "that anyone who takes a life will have to pay with his own."
One of our most important dances was in celebration for the bountiful goodness of maize, what you call corn. Today, Mazola margarine knows all about the goodness of corn. Mazola margarine is made from corn oil goodness, so Mazola margarine has no cholesterol, naturally. And Mazola tastes fresh and delicious, naturally. Remember Mazola margarine. It gets goodness from maize.
We want this paint job to keep that fresh painted look, so this time we're using Moore Glow. Our Benjamin Moore dealer said it's Moore's newest house paint. A high-quality latex paint that gives you a beautiful soft gloss finish. And Moore Glow is specially made to resist fading, so even after years of weathering, your house will keep its fresh painted look. Try Moore Glow.
It's the answer to a painter's dream.
Your Benjamin Moore dealer really knows paint.
The government reported today that the Consumer Price Index jumped 1.1% in April, the 3rd consecutive month that prices have increased more than 1%. If those prices rise the rest of the year, as they have from February through April, they will produce an annual inflation rate of 13.2%, almost double the administration's target. Ray Brady reports from New York.
You already know what's fueling inflation. Gasoline prices last month took their biggest jump since the Arab oil embargo, rising a high-octane 6%. An increase that means, so far this year, gasoline's gone up at an annual rate of 49.6%. Higher fuel prices affect everything. So in the cost of transportation, buying and running a car, riding a bus, up 2%. In another key area, the cost of running a house, up 1.1%. Buying a new house, up 1.3%. Food prices, still being pushed upward by beef and veal, rose 0.9%. Poultry prices held steady, though, and pork and fresh vegetables dropped, and government economists predicted food prices would soon level off. Alfred Kahn, the president's chief inflation fighter, outlined steps for consumers to help cool down prices.
Buy pork, not beef. Pork went down. Second, use less gasoline because that price is just out of our control. And third, don't speculate in new houses.
Still, other government figures show the average worker's paycheck last month lost 1% of its buying power. Its total loss so far this year comes to 4.1%. Another inflation effect, a sharp rise in the price of gold. Bullion today hitting a new record of $270.60 an ounce.
Gold traders say much of the buying is coming from the Middle East oil producers. They know how higher oil prices cut into the value of paper money, so they're putting many of the dollars they got from us into gold. Ray Brady, CBS News, New York.
The Agriculture Department said today it will order a special study to see if last month's 4.1% increase in beef prices was justified. A spokesman said there are some indications that increased middleman costs were excessive. It has not been a triumphant week for a president with majorities in both House and Senate. House Democrats turned against Mr. Carter on his oil decontrol plan, and some of them publicly announced their support for Edward Kennedy. But the president got a different reception today from the Democratic National Committee, and he obviously enjoyed the change. Bruce Morton has the story.
As of this moment, the campaign to re-elect the president is on.
The newly announced campaign started briskly. President Carter gave what White House regulars said was one of his strongest recent speeches, attacking a Congress which he said he and the voters see as incapable of action.
They see a Congress pushed and pulled in every direction by hundreds of well-financed and powerful special interests. They often see a balanced and fair approach that demands sacrifice, a little sacrifice from everyone, abandoned like an orphan. The American people don't like it, and neither do I.
The Democratic National Committee members applauded loudly and long. CBS News did a straw poll of the 237 members attending today's session, asking, who do you think the best Democratic candidate for president in 1980 would be? About 3/4 of those present answered, and among them, President Carter won big. Of course, National Committee members were named at the party's last convention, the one that nominated Carter, and even though the membership has changed some since, this is one group the president really should carry. Still, winning is a lot more fun than losing. More Carter good news. Democrats in Ohio's Cuyahoga County, that's Cleveland, had planned a convention tomorrow to endorse Senator Edward Kennedy for president. But today, County Chairman Tim Hagan said he'd been urged not to and would try to get the draft called off.
Well, emotionally, I'm obviously a supporter of Senator Kennedy. They've urged me to not accept a resolution for a draft on the floor tomorrow at the convention.
They included former Ohio Governor Michael DeSalle. Hagan also talked with Senator John Glenn.
In a situation like this, with an incumbent Democratic president, for anyone to mount a major effort against him is just going to split the party and guarantee a party loss in the general election, as I see it.
Chairman Hagan would have taken that advice, but when he got back home to Cleveland this evening, pro-Kennedy Democrats overruled him. So the draft Kennedy resolution will come up at Cleveland's convention tomorrow, and the betting there is it will pass. President Carter got some good political news here today, but those Kennedy movements around the country just keep bubbling away. Bruce Morton, CBS News, the White House.
Northeast of San Francisco, near Sonora, a young man is holding back an entire river by holding himself hostage. He's going against a force that could be even more formidable than nature, the federal government, and he vows to stay where he is until he's sure he's won. Harold Dow reports.
The Army Corps of Engineers says the new Malones Dam on California's Stanislaus River is necessary for flood control and hydroelectric power. But conservationists say, as the dam backs up the waters of the Stanislaus, it's ruining boating, inundating trees, wildlife, and archaeological sites. And so, when plans were announced to raise the water level higher to test the dam's hydroelectric generators, a young man named Mark DuBois hid out upriver and chained himself last Monday to a rock at the water's edge. If the river should rise, Mark DuBois would drown.
He's there in the canyon, there's no doubt in my mind, and he's completely willing to die for this.
The Corps of Engineers sent out search parties, but couldn't find Mark DuBois. In Sacramento, pressure mounted. Conservationists demonstrated. Governor Brown sided with them. And the Corps, thinking it might be a hoax, but not wanting to find out the hard way, backed down.
We have no plans to inundate an area where we have reason to believe that a person may be located.
Early this morning, after a 2-hour raft trip along the Stanislaus with some of DuBois' friends, we found Mark DuBois, chained and padlocked, as he had said, to a rock 2 feet from the water. The key, hidden, he said, 100 feet away.
My life is insignificant compared to all the life in this canyon, and I knew a long time ago that I wanted to help make that statement.
DuBois welcomed the news that the Corps had stopped raising the water level.
I'm really glad to hear that, and so yeah, I would be very anxious to come out if it looks like that is the agreement that's happened.
But you won't come out of here until you see it in writing?
Yeah, for sure. Or at least hear it from a source that, that I know really well.
DuBois and his followers will apparently agree to a slight raising of the water level for hydroelectric tests, but anything more, and he and others will be back at the water's edge. Harold Dow, CBS News, on California's Stanislaus River.
The Environmental Protection Agency today imposed tough air pollution standards for new power plants that burn coal. The key word is new, and the standards announced today will have no effect on coal-fired plants operating now because they are protected by the Clean Air Act. As a result, the EPA says the new standards won't even start to clean up the air for at least 15 years, and that coal-burning pollution will get worse before it gets better. The EPA says the new standards are expected to cost utilities about $35 billion by 1995. About a dozen families in a sparsely settled section of southern Mississippi left their homes today after state officials confirmed high radioactivity levels had been found in animals near a former underground nuclear test site. University of Mississippi scientists reported finding radioactive and deformed toads, frogs, and a lizard above the Tatum Salt Dome, which was used in the 1960s for nuclear explosions. Radioactivity in one frog reportedly was 1,000 times above normal. Officials appealed to residents to stay away while investigators tried to get more information. That could be 2 or 3 days. Hundreds of American soldiers fanned out through the Arlington National Cemetery today in a traditional Memorial Day salute to the nation's war dead and veterans buried there. The soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division, known as the Old Guard, placed miniature U.S. flags before each of almost 200,000 graves at Arlington. And the stock market today was mixed in trading of 27,810,000 shares.
Perfect eggs don't always start with the egg. They start with Silverstone. It's the most durable nonstick surface ever made by DuPont. And just to prove our point, we'll cook some eggs with these letters and still not hurt Silverstone's non-stick performance. See? So no matter what you're making, make sure you start with Silverstone. Silverstone spells durability.
The men: Jim Hall, Al Unser, racing men. Jim Bills, Al drives and wins. 3 times at Indianapolis. The car, the Pennzoil Chaparral. Proud and bright in its Pennzoil colors. Looks like a blur. The oil, Pennzoil. Because you don't take chances when you have the chance to win. If you've got a car, any car, we've got the oil. Pennzoil. Ask for it.
In the Israeli town of Beersheba today, Israel and Egypt, with the United States as a sort of mediator, opened talks on Palestinian autonomy. As expected, there were differences. The Egyptians calling for self-determination in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the Israelis vowing there would never be Palestinian sovereignty. Secretary of State Vance urged both sides to show maximum restraint and farsightedness. Several hours earlier and 60 miles away in the Sinai town El Arish, Israelis and Egyptians also met, and Doug Sefton was there.
El Arish and some 425 square miles of the Sinai, crossroads for invading armies since before biblical times, were turned over to Egypt today by Israel. It was the first installment on the Egyptian-Israeli peace deal that was more than a year in the making. It was a simple ceremony, but to many emotional. Military bands playing national anthems and the changing of the flags. President Sadat watched the event on television from his rest house in Alexandria. Despite the bitter opposition from the rest of the Arab world, the event left him more convinced than ever that the treaty was a good one.
I was not wrong. It has been proved today that I was right.
But the emotion triggered by the sight of the Israeli flag descending the staff after 12 years of army occupation proved too much for many of the thousands of Sinai residents separated from the ceremony by barbed wire fences. Israeli troops, who themselves were under stress, reacted forcefully against their tormentors. Fights broke out and vehicles used as bulldozers, and there were instances when bloodshed seemed inevitable. There were injuries, but none was reported serious. Israeli troops had just about restored order when Egyptian reinforcements arrived, and the ugly mood turned joyous. Observers felt the incidents were more an instantaneous emotional outburst rather than an example of deep-seated antagonism. It had quieted down just as quickly as it had flared up. The problem of the moment is when the borders between Egypt and Israel will be opened. Israel pressing for sooner, Egypt wanting to wait the 9 months called for in the treaty. The Israeli settlers of Niut pulled out yesterday, and today the last of the Israeli soldiers packed up and left the area to the Egyptians. If the day's events demonstrated anything, it's that even on the road to peace, the possibility of violence is never far away. Doug Sefton, CBS News, El Arish, Egypt.
The Ayatollah Hashemi Rafsanjani, one of Iran's top Muslim leaders and a main speaker at yesterday's anti-American rally in Tehran, was shot and wounded today. A group opposed to the Islamic Revolution claimed responsibility. The same group claims to have killed 2 other revolutionary leaders in Iran. Tens of thousands of Iranians turned out again today for another anti-American demonstration at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And this is how Iran's government-controlled television reported it.
The protesters showed their disapproval of the U.S. Senate resolution that had condemned the executions carried out by the Islamic Revolutionary Courts. The demonstrators condemned both the policies of the U.S. and Israeli governments and the recently signed Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. In these demonstrations, American flags and statues of Prime Minister Begin and President Carter were put on fire in front of the U.S. Embassy complex. Over 400 Revolutionary Guards had the responsibility of guarding the embassy's premises. However, no clashes or violence were reported among the participating groups.
Basque separatists today assassinated a Spanish general, 2 colonels, and their driver in downtown Madrid. The early morning submachine gun and hand grenade attack was Spain's worst urban terrorist violence in recent years. 54 persons have been killed by terrorists in Spain so far this year.
Look at all the pluses now in the Hearts 2-in-1 Plus collar. It kills fleas, ticks, even ticks that carry Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Plus, it's the longest-lasting collar ever from Hearts, so it keeps working on your dog or cat. And that means it helps protect your home and family. The Hearts 2-in-1 Plus collar's even effective if it gets wet. All those pluses add up to long-lasting protection you can trust.
Put the plus on your pet, the Hearts 2-in-1 Plus.
On your mark, get set, go. Nothing beats owning your own pool. To care for it, nothing beats HTH. It's 3 products in one. You can go out and buy a shock treatment or use HTH. You can go out and buy a bactericide or use HTH. You can go out and buy an algicide or use HTH. You can spend a whole lot of money or you can get a whole lot of pool care in a can. HTH. It's your money.
When NASA discovered the 85-ton Skylab was losing altitude last year, scientists ran through their contingency plans. They thought of sending the space shuttle up to give Skylab a boost. They tried to make orbital adjustments. They even talked of blowing Skylab up. None of that happened, and Skylab is now expected to crash to Earth around July 2nd. Science failed. So today a group was trying something science never heard of. Bill Plant has the story in Fort Lauderdale.
Lift for Skylab. And now, here's your Skylift host, world-famous psychic, Paige Bryant.
The psychics wanted to do what NASA couldn't, to raise the falling Skylab into a higher orbit so that it would remain in space. The experiment was broadcast to a network of 42 radio stations across the country, and listeners were asked to help by sending their psychic energy skyward.
We're going to use our energy so that Skylab will not fall, so that our space plans will not be interrupted. Help us to concentrate. Help us to speed Skylab forward, higher and higher.
Just give that energy to Skylab. Say, okay, Skylab, here's some more energy. Go faster and further.
The experiment lasted 10 minutes. Psychic Bryant said that she felt lightheaded and dizzy, and that she could feel it work. But on the space station's next communications pass, NASA reported no apparent change in its altitude, now 180 miles above the Earth. The group says it's still hoping things will change in the next few days. The space agency, which had to abandon its plans to keep Skylab in orbit after spending more than $20 million, viewed this offer of free psychic energy with amused tolerance. But it still expects Skylab to fall to Earth sometime between June 20th and July 14th. Bill Plant, CBS News, Fort Lauderdale.
That's the CBS Evening News this Friday. Walter will be back on Monday. I'm Roger Mudd. Good night.